How Bird's scooters killed short-distance transit. Picture this. It's September 2017 in Santa Monica, California, and residents wake up to find hundreds of electric scooters scattered across their sidewalks like some kind of urban invasion. No warning, no permits, no asking permission. Just a flood of lime green and black scooters appearing overnight, each one emblazoned with the logo of a company called Bird. Within hours, people are zipping down the street at 15 miles per hour, weaving between pedestrians, leaving these things dumped on every corner. This wasn't a pilot program or a careful rollout. This was venture capital warfare, and Travis van der Zanden, Bird's founder and former Uber executive, had just fired the opening shot in what would become the most destructive disruption in urban transportation history. In less than 2 years, Bird and its army of copycats would obliterate traditional short-distance transit options, reshape city infrastructure, and prove that sometimes moving fast and breaking things doesn't just disrupt markets, it annihilates them entirely. Van der Zanden didn't stumble into this revolution by accident. After getting fired from Uber in 2016 for allegedly stealing trade secrets, a claim he denied, but which resulted in a lawsuit, he was hungry for revenge against the ride-sharing industry that had cast him out. The former Lyft executive turned Uber executive turned Silicon Valley pariah had watched both companies dominate long-distance urban transit, but he spotted a massive gap in the market. Trips under 2 miles represented 40% of all urban travel, yet they were either too short for rideshares to be cost-effective or too long for comfortable walking. Traditional options were pathetic. Slow city buses that rarely showed up on time, expensive and limited bike share programs that required docking stations, or personal vehicles for absurdly short distances. Van der Zanden realized that if he could flood cities with accessible, affordable electric scooters before anyone could stop him, he could capture this entire market segment overnight. He raised $25 million in Series A funding by February 2018, then another $100 million in Series B by June 2018, giving Bird a valuation of $1 billion in less than a year, making it the fastest company in history to achieve unicorn status at that time. The execution was breathtakingly aggressive. Bird's strategy was simple: deploy first, apologize later. They would saturate a city with scooters in a single night, creating instant market presence before local governments could react. Each scooter cost about $400 to manufacture, but could generate $15 to $20 per day in revenue at peak utilization. The unit economics were compelling. Scooters that survived more than 3 months became profitable. But the real genius was in the network effects. The more scooters Bird placed, the more convenient they became for users, which increased utilization rates and justified even more scooters. By January 2018, Bird had expanded to 10 cities. By June, they were in 50 cities across America. Their scooters were logging over 2 million rides per month, with average trip distances of 1.3 miles and trip durations of 15 minutes. This wasn't gradual market penetration. This was blitzkrieg scaling that left traditional transit options scrambling to respond. The carnage Bird unleashed on existing short-distance transit was immediate and devastating. City bike share programs, which had spent years carefully building infrastructure and negotiating partnerships with municipalities, watched their ridership plummet overnight. Boston's Hubway system saw a 37% decrease in ridership within 6 months of scooter deployment. Washington, D.C.'s Capital Bike Share, which had been growing steadily since 2010, experienced its first significant decline in 2018, losing over 800,000 trips compared to the previous year. These weren't just numbers. They represented millions of dollars in lost revenue for systems that had required massive public investment to build. Traditional taxi companies and ride-sharing drivers found their short-distance rides evaporating. Why pay $8 for a 2-minute Uber ride when you could hop on a scooter for $3 and arrive faster? Even walking became less appealing when scooters offered a faster, more exciting alternative. Bird had identified the perfect storm. They were faster than walking, cheaper than ride shares, more flexible than public transit, and more convenient than bike shares. In less than 18 months, they had fundamentally altered how Americans thought about moving through cities. But Bird's success created chaos that went far beyond market disruption. Cities found themselves completely unprepared for the infrastructure demands of thousands of scooters appearing overnight. Sidewalks became obstacle courses as riders abandoned scooters wherever their trips ended, blocking wheelchair access, creating pedestrian hazards, and cluttering business entrances. Emergency rooms started reporting a new category of injuries: electric scooter accidents, which increased by 222% in cities with active scooter programs. A study in Austin found that scooter-related injuries occurred at a rate of 20 per 100,000 trips, significantly higher than bike-share programs. Police departments had to dedicate resources to scooter-related complaints and violations. City maintenance crews found themselves collecting and impounding hundreds of illegally parked scooters daily. The infrastructure costs were staggering. San Francisco spent over $100,000 in the first 6 months just on scooter removal and storage. Meanwhile, traditional transit infrastructure that cities had spent decades building, bike lanes, bus stops, pedestrian pathways, was being overwhelmed or rendered obsolete. Bird had essentially privatized portions of public transportation while externalizing all the costs and problems onto municipalities that had no legal framework to handle them. The competitive response Bird triggered turned destructive disruption into an all-out war. Lime launched just months after Bird with identical tactics and $250 million in funding from Google Ventures and Uber. Spin, Skip, Razor, and dozens of other companies flooded the market with their own scooter fleets. By mid-2018, some cities had over 20,000 scooters from multiple companies, creating a supply glut that made the dot-com bubble look restrained. Companies were burning through cash at unprecedented rates. Bird was spending over $60 million per quarter on scooter deployment and replacement by 2019. The average scooter lifespan dropped to just 28 days as companies prioritized rapid expansion over durability. Vandalism and theft became rampant, with cities reporting scooters thrown into rivers, hung from trees, and stripped for parts. The race to achieve market dominance led to increasingly desperate tactics. Companies would deploy scooters illegally in new cities overnight, engage in scooter wars, where competitors would sabotage or relocate each other's fleets, and offer unsustainable pricing to undercut rivals. This wasn't healthy competition. It was mutually assured destruction funded by venture capital. The regulatory backlash, when it finally came, proved that Bird's ask for forgiveness, not permission strategy had fatal flaws. Cities began implementing emergency bans, permit systems, and fleet caps that destroyed the unit economics Bird depended on. San Francisco limited the entire city to just 2 companies with 625 scooters each, a 95% reduction from peak deployment levels. Seattle imposed a cap of 1,000 scooters citywide and required companies to pay for city staff time spent on scooter-related issues. Portland demanded that companies provide real-time data feeds, maintain 95% uptime on their fleets, and ensure scooters were distributed equitably across all neighborhoods. The regulatory requirements weren't just bureaucratic obstacles, they were existential threats to Bird's business model. Permit fees, fleet caps, maintenance requirements, and liability insurance transformed scooters from a high-margin business into a heavily regulated utility. Companies that had been valued in the billions saw their prospects collapse as cities took control. Bird's valuation peaked at $2.85 billion in 2019, but crashed as regulated markets proved unprofitable. By 2020, the company was struggling to raise additional funding and had to lay off 30% of its workforce. The long-term damage Bird inflicted on urban transportation ecosystems became clear as the initial chaos settled. Traditional bike share programs that had taken years to build community trust and ridership never fully recovered. Many cities that had invested in comprehensive cycling infrastructure found their systems underutilized as scooters captured the casual rider market that bike shares depended on for financial viability. Public transit agencies reported decreased ridership on short-distance routes, undermining the fare revenue that subsidized longer routes for lower-income residents. The proliferation of private scooter companies created a fragmented transportation landscape where users needed multiple apps and payment systems instead of integrated public transit networks. Equity became a major issue as scooter companies focused deployment in wealthy neighborhoods with higher utilization rates, leaving low-income areas with limited service. Meanwhile, the infrastructure wear and tear from thousands of scooters required cities to redesign sidewalks, create new parking regulations, and hire additional enforcement staff, costs that were passed on to taxpayers rather than scooter users. Bird had successfully privatized the profits from short-distance transit while socializing the costs and consequences. The aftermath revealed the true scope of Bird's impact on short-distance transportation. By 2020, the scooter industry had attracted over $8 billion in venture funding, but had fundamentally altered urban mobility in ways that couldn't be undone. Traditional transportation providers that had served cities for decades were forced to adapt or die. Bike-share companies pivoted to electric bikes to compete with scooter speeds. Public transit agencies had to redesign short-distance routes. Urban planners found themselves accommodating scooter infrastructure instead of focusing on sustainable public transportation. The promise of reducing car dependency was partially fulfilled. Studies showed that 34% of scooter trips replaced car trips, but the cost was the destruction of more sustainable and equitable transportation alternatives. Bird's model proved that venture-funded disruption could move faster than democratic governance, but it also demonstrated that breaking things doesn't always create better outcomes. The company that had achieved unicorn status faster than any startup in history had simultaneously killed the very industry it was trying to disrupt, leaving cities with a more fragmented, expensive, and chaotic transportation landscape than they had before. Today, as Bird continues to struggle with profitability and most of its competitors have disappeared or merged, the company's legacy in urban transportation remains complex and cautionary. They proved that massive venture funding could overwhelm regulatory systems and destroy established industries with shocking speed. But they also revealed the hidden costs of prioritizing disruption over sustainability. Short-distance transit in major cities is now dominated by a handful of regulated scooter companies operating under strict municipal oversight, generating modest profits while serving a fraction of their peak ridership. The traditional alternatives they displaced, from bike shares to short bus routes, either adapted or died, leaving urban dwellers with fewer options and cities with higher infrastructure costs. Bird's revolution promised to solve the last-mile transportation problem, but instead, they created a new problem. How do you rebuild sustainable urban mobility after venture capital has strip-mined your transportation ecosystem? Van der Zanden got his revenge on the ride-sharing industry that had rejected him, but in the process, he may have dealt a fatal blow to the entire concept of efficient short-distance transit. Sometimes the most successful disruption is also the most destructive, and sometimes moving fast and breaking things means you can't put them back together again.